Thank you everyone for being with us. I know some of you it's PM and some of us it's AM. For me, it's nice and early at 9 a.m. Um, I'm really excited for this presentation. Before I hand it over to Natasha, I'm just going to acknowledge that I am on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm incredibly grateful to be on these beautiful lands and to be learning and unlearning. I am continually finding ways to indigenize my own life and my teaching and my practices, particularly through reading. I'm currently working on my doctorate and focusing on using a holistic paradigm, which really pulls from Indigenous ways of being and understanding everything is interconnected. So I'm constantly looking out into nature and understanding the ways in which we are interconnected and how our influence influences everything around us. So very grateful to be on this land and grateful for everyone who has joined us today. And Natasha, I'm going to hand it over to you and I'm going to mute myself and disappear. So it's all yours.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. So my name is Natacha Lazareff, and so I'm going to just give you a bit of around my background, because today we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome and perfectionism, but through the lenses of performance psychology. So you've probably guessed that I'm a performance psychologist. And what that means is that I'm actually a sport and exercise psychologist on the accreditation route with BASES here in the UK. So BASES is the British Association for Sport and Exercise Sciences. And I'm also the founder of the Performance Psychologist, which is a consultancy where I work basically with athletes, but also other high performers to really help them thrive in their particular area. And that means working both on the performance side of things, but also on the well-being side, so that people can really feel like they have that sustainable performance. And obviously, imposter syndrome and perfectionism has a lot of overlap in that, which makes it particularly interesting. And I've got a background in adventure and endurance sports myself, which is why I basically made it into the sporting world. Just before I get started, this is quite an informal session, so if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in a chat. We will have some time for a Q&A at the end, and I really want to hear from you guys. I make it quite interactive, so you'll see there are quite a lot of different activities as we go along. Please do engage with them as much as you can. Once again, the more you put in, the more you get out. And really my role is to teach mental skills. That's part of my role. So very much like any other type of skill, if you don't practice them, you won't get very much out of them. So it's a bit like a swimming drill. If you don't practice that swimming drill, that swimming technique is not going to improve. So what I'd recommend is that if any of these strategies and techniques that I'm going to go over today resonate with you, please do try them out for yourself and put them in practice so that you can see some results. Unfortunately, you won't come out of this 1 hour presentation all of a sudden an expert on imposter syndrome and perfectionism. It doesn't quite work like that. Okay, let's get started with that. All of that being said. So the objectives of this session is very much obviously understanding imposter syndrome and perfectionism as much as we can in such a short amount of time, getting a bit of an awareness of our own perfectionistic tendencies, or at least understanding what different elements there are to perfectionism. It's not quite as simple as some people might think initially, and ultimately, obviously, finding and learning techniques to deal with perfectionism and imposter syndrome. Okay, let's get into it. So definitely here in the UK, this video by an interview with Ilona Marr, who is a very famous rugby player. She's probably, I think she's the most famous female rugby player. She's got a ridiculous amount of followers on every type of social media, and she just transferred to the UK because she's American. So I'm sure you've probably all heard of her, and you've probably all seen this interview because it went pretty viral. But I think it's a really good way of introducing imposter syndrome. So let's have a quick watch.
How do you overcome imposter syndrome?
I don't have that.
Really?
No, I don't know what that. It's
What?
like you don't feel like you deserve it.
Yeah.
No, I don't think I have it. And
Okay,
everyone
like
else-
how is that possible? I feel like imposter syndrome ruins my life sometimes.
I feel like I deserve what I've gotten. I think that I've worked very hard, even in the rugby space. Like I went and play. I've played sports my whole life. I went and played rugby at South Burlington High School, and then I made the late decision to play rugby here, and then I transferred here to play rugby, and then I do all the work off the field. I posted videos consistently from Tokyo till now. I posted many videos a day. I put myself out there. I put my whole personality, my whole everything out there.
So basically, you're just saying, don't even acknowledge it.
I just don't think I have that.
I love it.
Which I think is also like people are told sometimes to feel like they have that imposter syndrome. But it's okay to be proud of what you've done. It's okay to believe you deserve something because you've put in the work for it.
Okay, so for those people who haven't seen this video or aren't aware of it, there was quite a lot of backlash against the interviewer, and people were like, why would you just assume that she has imposter syndrome once you've asked her and she's said that she doesn't have it? Why do you continue pushing that topic? I think we'll actually see throughout this presentation that it's not a totally crazy thing to ask an elite female athlete, and it's not a totally crazy thing to assume that she might have it. But what's really great to see is that Ilona Maher doesn't have those feelings, and she has a very good understanding of how she deserves to be where she is. Unfortunately, when you have imposter syndrome, it's not just as easy as people highlighting how far you've come. It can be quite difficult to see your journey and to see how much effort has gone into it, and accept your achievements in the way that they should be accepted. So hopefully it's a good introduction, and you'll see how a lot of people unfortunately don't have this really healthy way of seeing their career in the same way that Ilona Maher has. So if we continue looking at what is imposter syndrome, it's characterized by enduring feelings of inadequacy, crucially that will conflict with reality and potentially how other people perceive the individual. So it's often people who've achieved great things but can't accept that achievement and are worried that they're going to be discovered and outed as a fraud. Potentially surprisingly enough, it does affect a big part of the population. So research has shown that approximately 70% of the population will experience imposter syndrome at some point in their life. So it's really quite an important phenomenon. And this is the interesting part, it is especially common in high achievers and in women and other underrepresented groups. Now we know that in sport we have a lot of high achievers, and so once again we have an elite athlete who's a woman. I don't think it's crazy for the interviewer to ask her if she's ever experienced imposter syndrome, considering that this is such a prevalent prevalent thing in elite sport. If we look at some of the risk factors, the cultural and environmental factors that contribute to imposter syndrome. Now, sport is unfortunately, it can be a really harsh environment, and there's a lot of emphasis that is often put on achievement, on outcomes, on winning. So it's also not totally strange that we find a lot of imposter syndrome within sport. With women, we have a lot of women are brought up still. It's a bit of a societal issue, I would say, where women are still brought up a bit differently to men, and with a lot of emphasis on perfection and being and doing things in the right way, which sometimes are not quite put onto little boys in the same way. And if you come from a family environment where there's a lot of emphasis that has been put on achievement, then that can also lead to imposter syndrome later on. And there are also other personal characteristics that can contribute, such as perfectionism, that we're going to look at a little bit more later, and low self-esteem. So it's the bottom line is it's quite difficult to find very precise predictors, and the research also highlights that, you know, we don't really know if there's really causation, but there's definitely like correlation, and there's definitely a lot relationship between perfectionism, imposter syndrome, low self-esteem, and these other factors that all contribute. But it's quite difficult to identify very specific aspects that can lead to imposter syndrome. Now, the impacts of imposter syndrome can be massive, and that's why it's really important to talk about it and to do more research on the topic. We get negative self-talk that leads to self-doubt, self-criticism. Then there's a lot of emotional well-being, depression, anxiety, pressure, frustration. And all of that then has a lot of behavioral consequences, such as decreased performance, which is a real issue as an athlete, burnout, self-sabotage, not taking up opportunities when they come to you, a lot of different areas that really impact life satisfaction at the end of the day. So it really highlights how important it is to find ways of either supporting athletes who might have imposter syndrome, or finding ways to deal with it if it's something that you're experiencing yourself. So you might be wondering, I mean, I did hint at it a little bit, where perfectionism comes into this. I like to group perfectionism and imposter syndrome together because they have a lot of overlap. And once again, all perfectionists don't necessarily feel like imposters, and people who have imposter syndrome don't necessarily have perfectionism, but they are often grouped together, and they have a lot of similarities. Both share this fear of failure. There's a lot of self-doubt, despite often in both categories people being high achievers and achieving objectively great things. There's also this idea of setting yourself unrealistically high standards that are very inflexible, and finally this crazy hard work to prove your worth. A lot of this will resonate a lot for people who work in sport or who do sport themselves. Now, the key difference I would say between perfectionism and imposter syndrome lies within, you know, the core beliefs. Perfectionists are ultimately focused on achieving perfection, whereas people with imposter syndrome will just be constantly doubting their achievements and fearing that they are going to be uncovered and exposed as being fraud. So there's slight differences in the core beliefs, but ultimately they are packaged in a very similar way. So we're now going to look a little bit at perfectionism, and we're all a bit bored of hearing me talk to myself like this. I feel like I'm just chatting to the screen. So I'm gonna make you do a bit of work yourself. We're gonna go through a perfectionism questionnaire to try and highlight if you have any elements of perfectionism yourself. Now, this is adopted from the Frost multi-dimensional perfectionism scale. It's specific, it's been adapted to sport. Ultimately, this is the brief questionnaire. It's only 8 questions. So there's only so much we can unveil in 8 questions, but hopefully it'll start giving you a bit of an idea of the different dimensions of perfectionism, because perfectionism is definitely more complex than one might think. And I mean, both imposter syndrome and perfectionism are these terms that are used a lot in the media and sometimes a little overused, and so I think the core complexities are sometimes lost through this overuse of these words. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to present a question up on the screen, and for each question it's just a statement. You need to write down on a piece of paper or on your phone, whatever you have by your side, how much you agree with the statement. And it's a rating from 1 to 5. It will all come up on a screen and be clear. So just write down a number for each question. 1 being I strongly disagree with this statement, all the way up to 5, I strongly agree. Like any questionnaire, don't overthink it. I really want you to go with your gut feeling. And this is a really, really important one. There are no right or wrong answers. Once again, perfectionism is not black and white. It's very much more complex than that. So really try to answer as honestly as you can, and then we'll go through what these answers might mean. Okay, is everybody ready? Let's get started. So, question 1. If I fail at my sport, I am a failure as a person. 1, I strongly disagree with this statement, all the way to 5, I strongly agree with this statement. Please just write down the number that works best for you. So if I fail at my sport, I am a failure as a person. I'm going to go through these questions quite quickly. So yeah, I'm not going to give you too much time to overthink it. Question 2. I set higher goals for myself than most people. Do you strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree? Just write down a number. I set higher goals for myself than most people. Question 3. If a teammate or opponent of comparable ability races better than me, then I feel like I failed to some degree. How much do you agree with this statement? If a teammate or opponent of comparable ability races better than me, then I feel like I failed to some degree. Question 4. I have extremely high goals for myself in my sport. I have extremely high goals for myself in my sport. Just write down a number. Question 5. I feel that other athletes generally accept lower standards for themselves in sports than I do. I feel that other athletes generally accept lower standards for themselves in sport than I do. Question 6. I do not do well if I do not do well all the time in competition, I feel that people will not respect me as an athlete. So if I do not do well all the time in competition, I feel that people will not respect me as an athlete. Question 7. I think I expect higher performance and greater results in my daily training than most athletes. I think I expect higher performance and greater results in my daily training than most athletes. And for the very last question, question 8, people will probably think less of me if I make mistakes in competition. People will probably think less of me if I make mistakes in competition. Okay, so hopefully you've got your scores for all 8 questions. It really doesn't matter if you've missed one or the other. It's very much just to get you thinking about the different elements that might constitute perfectionism. Now for the answers, what I'd like you to do is sum up your scores for questions 2, 4, 5, and 7. And this will give you a perfectionistic striving score. And then also sum up your scores for questions 1, 3, 6, 8, which will then give you your perfectionistic concerns score. So I'm just going to give you a minute to do this. You can use a calculator. You don't have to, if maths is not your forte, you can just use a calculator and do it quickly. But yeah, I'll give you a minute to do that very quickly before we continue and then explore what these different scores might mean. And hopefully this highlights once again that perfectionism has different elements to it. So hopefully people have had time to sum up their scores. And once again, there's not necessarily like a good or a bad score. Perfectionism, yeah. Let's look at the next page and you'll understand a little bit better. So perfectionism is very much or lies on a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum we have what we call perfectionistic strivings, and on the other we have perfectionistic concerns. And so there's definitely elements of perfectionism that can be more positive, whereas there are some that will then tip the balance into something that can affect athletes and people in general and impact their performance or their behaviors more. So on one side, with perfectionistic strivings, we have individuals who are setting high but achievable goals, and obviously this is something we really want to see in sport. But it can really quickly tip over into setting high but unrealistic standards. And really, I highlight the difference between goals and standards. Like, standards become nearly rules, expectations, and there's really this idea of them being very rigid and inflexible, which is the next point. So with perfectionistic concerns, you'll have people who are very inflexible in the pursuit of their goals, whereas if you're tipping more on the side of perfectionistic strivings, you can have a bit more of a flexible approach. And this is absolutely vital because we know that there's a whole host of things that life can throw at us that can interfere with our goals, and that shouldn't but it shouldn't really impact our feelings of achievement. On one side, we have this real drive to improve, whereas on the other, it's a drive to avoid mistakes. And this is a big thing that we'll also find, we spoke about it already in imposter syndrome. This fear of failure is one of the big elements that impacts performance, because if you're fearing or if you're trying to avoid mistakes, you're not taking risks, you're not pushing, you're not reaching your potential, and so that can be really restrictive. And a big one finally is the fact that your self-worth is very much based on meeting your unrealistic standards if you have perfectionistic concerns, whereas your self-worth is more is set on a whole host of different things if you have a healthier relationship with perfectionism. So although we talk about perfectionism as a whole, it's really worth understanding that it's not quite so black and white. Perfectionism or perfectionistic tendencies can be positive in sport, but they can also be negative depending on how they show up for a certain person. And it's worth highlighting that most people have perfectionistic tendencies in some elements of their life. And so it's really something that everybody can relate to, even though it can obviously take different formats and be on in different let's say packages. With this in mind, we're going to look at the cycle of perfectionism. This is very much compatible with imposter syndrome as well. So they have a very similar cycle. Perfectionism, like imposter syndrome, they're all based on very rigidly upholding high standards for yourself. And there's a similar idea that it's something that is often influenced by cultural or environmental factors. So a lot of maybe the environment you were brought up in, and the environment that you're now performing in. And what we can see with this cycle is that this self-worth that is made up from our childhood or from our environments then ends up it basically ends up with these underlying rules and assumptions that we have for ourselves. So really, I must attain this goal. I can't be seen to be doing this, and all of that leads to very high standards, expectations for ourselves, which then obviously, in order to be able to uphold these unrelenting standards, we engage in perfectionistic behaviors. These behaviors are very similar for people who've got imposter syndrome as well. Excessive checking, but actually just working really, really hard because you feel like you have to compensate. Procrastination is a really big behavior for both imposter syndrome and perfectionism. It really comes from fear of failure, and the fear of failure is so great that you just putting off facing up to that task because you're so worried that you're going to make a mistake or that you're going to fail at it. There's obviously a lot of self-sabotage that can happen as well within that, and it's going to lead to perfectionistic thinking, so quite a lot of all or nothing. If I can't win this, why am I even bothering? Always looking out for mistakes or signs of failure. And then when we get to the actual performance, either you manage to meet these really high standards, but what's interesting here is that you don't even really get any satisfaction from meeting these standards. It's more of a relief because you've put so much pressure on yourself to meet them, and that relief is only lasts for a very short amount of time until you decide that it's just, if you've met them, then it must not have been good enough, and then set even higher goals for yourself. So it's really, it goes back through the whole vicious cycle until you end up failing to meet those standards because they are so potentially unrealistic and inflexible. And then of course you then fall into this whole cycle of self-criticism that affects your self-worth and recycles through the whole cycle all over again. And with imposter syndrome, you're staying more on that idea that you feel like you're failing to meet standards whatever happens, and so you're always stuck on that left hand side of the diagram. So the key thing is that, and when I'm talking about perfectionism here, I am very much talking more about the perfectionistic concerns, by the way. It's a bit of a myth in sport that perfectionism can really help you with your performance. If the perfectionism stays on the healthy side of the spectrum, then of course it can. But as soon as it veers into these perfectionistic concerns, it can really impact your ability to achieve your goals, and so it's really problematic from an athlete's perspective. Nothing is ever going to be enough. Even when you meet your high standards, you're not going to be satisfied. So we've looked at a lot of the problems and what these what imposter syndrome and perfectionism looks like. We're now going to start looking a little bit at solutions or ways of coping with it. And in order to understand, or to understand how we can deal with imposter syndrome and perfectionism, we're going to look at what happens in the mind. So I have a CBT approach to psychology, a cognitive behavioral training approach. And what cognitive behavioral means is that we believe that thoughts, cognitions, leads to emotions and feelings that then leads to the behavioral, the consequences. And then these feed back into thoughts, feelings, consequences. So we have this loop and cycle, which is extremely relevant to the issues that we see in imposter syndrome and perfectionism. So the thoughts we get in both of these cases are self-criticism, self-doubt, what a feeling of worthlessness, and then the emotional consequences are pressure, anxiety, depression, and then the behavioral consequences, burnout, less enjoyment of your sport, poor performance, self-sabotage, and then all of that feeds back into feelings of not being worthless, self-criticism, etc., and the whole loop starts again. So with a CBT approach, the first port of call is to try and interrupt this cycle. It makes sense, right? We want to stop this whole cycle from cycling through over and over again. So my particular approach to CBT is actually ACT, acceptance commitment training. So some people will talk about changing those thoughts and changing negative thoughts into more positive thoughts. My approach to psychology is more about accepting uncomfortable thoughts that show up, but choosing not to direct our attention and energy, or choosing not to waste our attention and energy on these unhelpful thoughts, and instead redirecting our attention and energy into value-aligned action that are going to help us achieve our goals. So one way of doing that is through the ACE formula. Now, I want to highlight that this is not necessarily like a super easy strategy. I mean, this is, if I was working one-on-one with someone, this is something we would spend several sessions working on. So we've probably spend 20, 30, 40 years of our lives engaging in the same thought patterns. So changing or changing the way our relationship with our thoughts is never going to be that straightforward, but it is extremely effective once it works. So it does take practice, but it does work really well for most people if you commit to it. Now, ACE is a good acronym to remember, and it starts with A for acknowledge the thought. Now, what I will ask everybody to do is to think of a thought that comes up for you when you're going through a difficult experience, and maybe just write it down on a piece of paper. So if you can take a minute to come up with a thought that you might have, just so that you can practice this with that specific thought. So my thought is, I'm not good enough. So that's the thought I'm going to go with. And the first step is to acknowledge the thought. So what I'm going to do is say, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough. So you're acknowledging the thought, but you're adding I'm having the thought that in front of it. And that creates a certain amount of distance from that thought, which is already really useful, so that you don't get completely reeled in by that thought and start thinking that it's a reality and start believing it and feeding into it. So the first step of ACE is just acknowledge the thought, and you're creating a bit of distance by doing that. The second step is the C, connect with your body. Now, this is micro mindfulness for those who are experienced in mindfulness. And here you could do that in any way you like. A very common way of connecting with your body is just pushing your feet down into the ground. So you can try doing that right now. It's quite a subtle way of doing it as well, so it's not too obvious for the people around you. Really choose a way that works for you. You could also have your fingers and just push them against each other like this. But the idea is to really get yourself out of your overthinking mind and back into the present, and feeling your body. And finally, a really important one for us in acceptance commitment training is engage in what you're doing. And what I mean by engage, you want to be engaging with purpose into something that is value aligned and is bringing you closer towards your goals, which for an athlete should be quite easy to do. I think quite a lot of athletes are quite clear on their goals. They might not all be clear on their values, but that's a different story. But they should be clear on their values if they possibly can. But redirecting your attention and energy towards something that is bringing you closer to your goals is extremely effective to get you out of your mind. We really get caught up a lot in thinking about the past or the future, and that's really not helpful for our present performance ultimately. Okay, so remember, ACE is a good initial way of, or is a good first technique to unhook from these unhelpful thoughts of, specifically of self-criticism, low self-worth, and self-doubts that you get in perfectionism and imposter syndrome. A couple of other strategies that can work. Once again, we don't have an enormous amount of time to go through all of these. So these are a couple of ideas to explore. Setting process goals and really focusing on the journey, not the destination, is a really great way of getting rid of that fear of failure, or getting over some of those feelings of fear of failure, and taking away quite a lot of the pressure. Ultimately, we can't control a lot of outcomes, but we can control the process. We can control the how, but not necessarily the what that comes at the end. We can't control the score of a game, but we can control how we show up, how we play. And if we just bring our best possible performance and our best possible selves, then we can get a lot of satisfaction from that. And a really big one for imposter syndrome is measuring that progress and highlighting that progress. So really reminding ourselves how far we've come. And I'm going to show you a couple of good techniques to do that in the next slide. But as we saw with Ilona Marr, she had a really clear idea of how much work she'd put in and how far she'd come. Now, another good strategy is just seeking support. And I know this may sound obvious, but imposter syndrome especially is really alienating. People really feel very alone. They feel like they don't belong in a group. And once again, this idea that somebody is going to unmask them. And so it's really important to try and, if you really do feel like you don't belong somewhere, or that you don't deserve your achievements, ask for feedback, for constructive feedback from people that you trust, from your coaches, from people that you're close to, your loved ones, and really try and connect with people around you to get past that alienation. In perfectionism, there's also this big idea that you see other competitors as, a threat to your success, and it can be really helpful to adopt more of a growth mindset and see them as opportunities to learn and grow. And I mean, as we all know, Federer said that he was extremely grateful that Nadal came on a scene, because he would not be half the player he is today if Nadal hadn't turned up and challenged him and made him work really hard. So we want strong competitors, and we want to be able to connect with other people, and obviously ask for help when we need it. A support network is an athlete's really is a really valuable resource for any athlete. And finally, developing self-compassion, a really difficult one. We've seen that self-criticism is quite a big one, both in imposter syndrome and perfectionism. So we want to try and become more aware of the way that we speak to ourselves, and try and ask ourselves, is that the way I would speak to my best friend? And if it isn't, then potentially try and change that. A big thing in self-compassion is what we call common humanity, is reminding ourselves that everybody struggles, like human beings struggle. It's kind of part of being a human being to struggle. So everybody goes through these kind of struggles at some point in their life, and it's part of being a human being. And then once again, taking time to ground yourself in the present moment is also really useful, and trying to get yourself out of just that that overthinking loop. So here there's a bit of an example I've written: "This sucks, be kind to yourself." It's a good way of a practical way of implementing self-compassion. The first part of the sentence is acknowledging the struggle, acknowledging the pain you're going through, whatever it is. This sucks, this is really difficult. Sport is difficult. And then an element of kindness afterwards. Be kind to yourself is a good one, but it could be whatever you like. It's also really effective to speak to yourself in the second person, so to refer to yourself as you rather than I, because we tend to believe it more when we speak to ourselves in the second person compared to the first person. So here are a couple of quick tips and strategies that can be implemented to help deal with imposter syndrome and perfectionism. This is two exercises that can be really good, right, to highlight that progress, and also to focus a little bit more on the positives as well as the negatives. So on the left hand side, I just have some prompts about your season, your performance. It's really, the idea is to see where you've come from and how far you've come from. So please feel free to answer these. We do have a couple of minutes, so do have a little think about it. It might be something that you want to have a bit more time to think about. So you can take a screenshot, or I'm sure that Amy will send through some slides if anybody needs them. But these are the kind of questions that you want to ask yourself, or ask your athletes if you're working with athletes, to sometimes build that confidence up and really remind them of all of the hard work they've put in and the fact that they really deserve these achievements. The second one might be a tool that some of you already have heard of. Basically, it's just another way of reflecting after a race. I really like it because it's a very balanced way of looking at things. So often athletes are really quick at highlighting all of the things they could have done better in a race, but that's not the only thing that we should be looking at, and we should really take the time to celebrate all the things that did go well as well. So on the left hand side, we really have what was effective, what was good, what went well, what do we want to continue. And then of course on the right hand side, we also have what was ineffective and what we'd like to change. And then all of this can give us some tools to feed into an action plan that we then feed into our training in order to improve for the next time. But it's really important not to forget that left hand side, which is the effectiveness, and really celebrate what went well. We obviously have a negativity bias as human beings, so it's completely normal for us to focus on those negatives, but it's really important for self-confidence and self-worth to take some time to also celebrate those wins. And so these are some good tools that you can also use either on yourself or with your athletes. My final exercise for the day, I'd like you to have a little think about what goal you'd like to set yourself as a result of this session. Hopefully you have a bit more of an understanding of some of the perfectionistic or imposter syndrome behaviors that come up. So either you've identified this as something that that comes up with you yourself, or it's something that comes up with the athletes you work with. So if you're up for it, I would like you to try and think of what kind of behavior, what kind of goal you'd like to target or target, then on like what kind of behavior you'd like to target, and then write a goal that you'd like to put in place to reduce this behavior, and then just set a time frame for putting that goal into motion. Of course, when you write out a specific goal, you can use the SMART goals techniques or whatever goal setting you may be familiar with. But the main thing is we want to remind everybody is to be realistic and to be flexible, and the goals can change. And that's one of the key elements of definitely of perfectionism, but also of imposter syndrome, where we hold these rules very rigidly, and we don't let ourselves any space to adapt and be flexible, and that can really impact our well-being and our performance ultimately. I will give you a couple of minutes. Do people feel like they need a couple of minutes to do that now, or do we want to move on? I think because we're running quite short on time, I might just move on, but please take the time to fill this out if you're interested at the end of the session. The key takeaways, hopefully you've got a bit more understanding around how perfectionism and imposter syndrome can show up and what those behaviors and thoughts look like. So you can now identify them if they come up for yourself or for people that you're working with. Now that you have some ideas of different strategies you can put in place to cope or deal with perfectionism and imposter syndrome, please experiment with them. see if any of them work for you, and then once you've identified something that piques your interest, practice it, so that it really becomes a strong skill that you can put in place when the going gets hard. And ultimately, really just remember to be kind to yourself, especially if you are the person who is experiencing this perfectionism or imposter syndrome. It's really easy to just beat yourself up because you're not doing things well enough, but ultimately it's not helpful. That's it from me. So ultimately, if you have a minute to fill in the feedback, that would be amazing. I always want to get some, constructive feedback so that I can grow. Feel free to obviously contact me in any way you'd like, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.